If you enjoy Jerusalem Unplugged, you may also like to listen to Stories from Palestine podcast. My name is Crystal. I'm originally from the Netherlands. I am married to a Palestinian and I live in Beit Safafa between Bethlehem and Jerusalem. I studied history and tour guiding and I produce a weekly podcast called Stories from Palestine. You can find it on your favorite podcast player or go to the website storiesfrompalestine.info.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today it's with great pleasure that my guest is Dr. Itamar Radai. Itamar is Senior Lecturer in Israel Studies at the Open University of Israel, and is mostly working on the history of British mandatory Palestine, with a focus on the crucial period of 1947-1948, but he also has been developing new projects, which we will discuss throughout the interview. In 2016, he published a seminal and very important work. The book was published by Routledge, Palestinians in Jerusalem and Jaffa, 1948, A Tale of Two Cities. Of course, he published a number of articles discussing the question of the decline of the Arab middle class in the same period of time in a number of chapters. But first of all, Itamar, welcome.
Thank you very much, Roberto. I'm glad to be here.
Now, Itamar, the first question I have is very much about your work on Jerusalem and Jaffa in this case. And I was wondering if you can tell us a little about yourself and how you began to work on this very controversial period of time in the history of Israel-Palestine in 1947, 1948, and also why on Jerusalem and Jaffa?
Wow, these are really difficult questions, I have to say. I am a native of Jerusalem. I was born in Jerusalem. My parents immigrated to Israel from Romania several years before I was born. My family has both Romanian and Hungarian ancestry, so our ancestry is Eastern European. No family connection to the Middle East. My wife has a partially Middle Eastern ancestry, but I have no Middle Eastern roots in my family before marriage, I mean. So I grew up in Jerusalem, in West Jerusalem, which is an Israeli Jewish city. And I was not exposed much to Arab and Palestinian culture and language until I was 17 and a half. At 17 and a half, I had an opportunity to go to a place called Givat Chaviva, a seminar of the Shomer HaTzair movement of kibbutzim, which is also a place of joint, or used to be a place of joint cooperation between Jews and Arabs in Israel. And I went there for 8 months to study Arabic and also some Middle Eastern studies. So it was my first opportunity to get in touch with the subject. And later on, when I landed on university, I took a BA with majors in Islamic and Middle Eastern studies and history. So it was quite obvious, since I had already the knowledge in the Arabic language and the initial knowledge of Middle Eastern history, that I chose these subjects and these courses. And then later, when I started my graduate studies, I didn't know at the beginning to which field I'm going to choose, but when it became clearer that my path would lead me towards modern history, then again, my knowledge in Arabic have led me towards archival research in Arabic documents, which in Israel is possible mainly in the Israeli archives through the reading of Palestinian Arab documents that were confiscated mainly in the 1948, during the 1948 war. I might say that actually it was the desire to conduct archival research that brought me mainly to this field as a scholar. And it also, might say, directed me to write my PhD dissertation at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem on the history of the Palestinians in Jerusalem and in Jaffa in 1948.
I want to start the conversation about your book, asking something about Jerusalem. Now, with previous guests of the podcast, we often discuss Jerusalem in the ancient past, throughout the Ottoman era. We also discussed 1967, contemporary Jerusalem. But actually, this is the first time we focus on this crucial period of sort of the end of the British Mandate. So I was wondering if you can just tell us a little bit how Jerusalem looked like in 1947, 1948, so before and at the beginning of the war.
So Jerusalem looked quite different than the city that people who grew up in Jerusalem in the post-1967 Jerusalem, like myself. I was born in 1972. Jerusalem of the pre-1948 Jerusalem was quite different. In 1947, Jerusalem had 165,000 inhabitants, out of which about 100,000 Jews, about 30,000 Christians and 35,000 Muslims. So if you look upon actually the Palestinian Arab communities of Jerusalem, we see, and it's also very different than the communities that we know now, Palestinian Jerusalemites today, we can see that the community was divided almost half and half between Muslims and Christians. So in this way, it was much more diverse, much more cosmopolitan community, and it included not only people of Arab descent. It included also thousands of Greeks, thousands of Armenians, Russians, Bulgarians, up until the Second World War, of course, Germans, and British officials and police and the army officers and their families. So all this together, combined also with Jewish communities of various backgrounds, like the German Jews, for example, made up for really rich and diverse fabric of life in a cosmopolitan Jerusalem. I would say perhaps a Jerusalem that was also a junction of cultures between East and West up until now.
I was curious about something again related to Jerusalem in particular, and then later on I want to just touch upon Jaffa briefly. How hard is to discuss Jerusalem, the events that surrounded the city between 47 and 48? How hard is to talk about these events today? My feeling is that every time you try to engage in a discussion about what happened in Jerusalem during the war, everything becomes political, and so it's either going one way or another, or actually people some sort of stay away from that because it's some sort of a dangerous ground. So I was wondering, you delved into that, and I was wondering how difficult it was for you to actually engage, in a topic like this.
Of course, it is very difficult. I mean, if I would have known in the beginning, but I was maybe more naive when I started to delve into these topics more than 20 years ago. I started actually my graduate studies. Personally, I think that for a long time I felt more detached because my family didn't live in Jerusalem in 1948. My parents arrived in Jerusalem as new immigrants in the 1960s. They came to the Hebrew University that was at the time the only main university in Israel. And I think that at the time that my parents arrived in Israel, they were very naive and ignorant of the history of the Arab-Israeli or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. at the time. It was also, pre-1967 Israel. And I grew up in post-1967 Jerusalem, which might also was kind of West Jerusalem, in a way, was a kind of a bubble. Even though, in my childhood, for example, I grew up until age 4 in the very center of West Jerusalem. And one of my first memories as a child at age 3 was an explosion just underneath our home, which actually, we might say, have shaken my world by all means. So we were aware of the existence of, we had an awareness of the existence of the conflict and the political considerations, but it was not a part of daily life, with the exception, some exceptions that came infiltrated into our daily routine sometimes. And when I started, actually, as I told you, I was really doing this from a total academic feeling of research and feeling of detachment from the reality. However, the longer and longer you delve into it, and you read and you study, and you cannot ignore the repercussions that the history has also on the present, both in Jerusalem and in Israel and in Palestine, Palestinian territories as a whole. So, yes, you find yourself at some certain point asking, why didn't I study the history of, let's say, Italy in the Middle Ages? It would have been so politically, so more convenient, and nobody would have ever argued my political motives and inclinations and so far. On the other hand, you say, someone has got to do it too. So someone got to do this historical study as well. And as a historian, I believe that we historians boldly go when no one has gone, or only few people have gone before us, regardless of the, might say, the collapse implications. Don't you think so?
I would agree with you that it would be much, much easier to just work on, I don't know, Roman history, where obviously there are debates amongst archaeologists and historians about the interpretation of certain events, but they're not controversial to the point that they're affecting contemporary lives. Even there are issues because, again, sometimes in the contemporary political spectrum, you have parties, comparing the barbaric invasion, which actually never happened, by the way. I mean, at least historians always tell us they didn't happen, but they use the term barbaric invasion then to look at the migrants coming into Europe, like the same. But other than that, really, you're right. It's much, much different. And I really want to bring you to a number of these very controversial events that you discuss in the book, and they're part of the history of Jerusalem during the war. Events like Deir Yassin, the Hadassah convoy. And so that brings me to the question of how did Jerusalem experience the war? Was it a front city? Was it at the margins? How did the sides, and more importantly, the side that you looked at, sort of looked at Jerusalem and sort of what were the, I would say, the lines that they drew in order to say, okay, we want the city, and this is what we're going to do in order to get the city, but we can't go beyond that?
Well, Jerusalem was, of course, in the heart, in the epicenter of the 1948 war. As is well known, according to the partition resolution accepted by the UN in late 1947, it should have been a corpus separatum, a separated area under international government, but this never materialized, and from an early stage, Jerusalem began to be the theater of fighting, at first between Jews and Palestinian Arabs, and then between Israelis and Jordanians for several months. So it has been actually a formative event, not only in the history of Israel and in the history of Palestine, but also in the history of Jerusalem. The war was a formative event. It tore apart Jerusalem, and it actually drew again the map of Jerusalem, and it was even a more formative event than the 1967 war. because the separation between West Jerusalem and East Jerusalem as political concepts and rather than geographical concepts actually started in 1948. In a part even during the war and mostly following the consequences of the war and the armistice agreement with Jordan that actually partitioned the city into two parts, the Jordanian Jerusalem and Israeli Jerusalem, and it totally drew again the map in a way that people who currently live in the city, I think that mainly Jewish Israelis, but also Palestinians sometimes are having difficulties to figure out the extent of the changes that have gone through, especially in what became West Jerusalem, where an entire Palestinian community or communities were actually uprooted from their homes, which became Jewish Israeli neighborhoods until this day. And also in the old city of Jerusalem, where the historical Jewish quarter was also uprooted, and until 1967 also became a Palestinian Arab neighborhood, only to be reinstituted following 1967 as a Jewish neighborhood, but as a very totally different way than historically, actually totally different story than the historical Jewish quarter that existed up until 1948. To a lesser extent, also in places like even Sheikh Jarrah, which persisted as a Palestinian neighborhood for 1948. However, small Jewish enclaves such as Shimon HaTzadik that existed in the neighborhood up until then were also uprooted, only to pop up as major political problems later on, which culminated actually only in recent years, while we still see here the repercussions of the events of 1948.
I'm curious about something. In your book, you talk about the collapse of the Palestinian leadership, and you start the chapter talking about Katamon, which was a very important neighborhood of Jerusalem, mostly a Palestinian neighborhood with obviously different ethnicities. Also, Greeks lived there, and nowadays obviously is a part of West Jerusalem at large, I would say. And I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about what happened to that neighborhood, then starting from there, what happened to the Palestinian leadership? Because again, later on, you're talking about Jerusalem resists. So it feels like there's a sort of dichotomy. There is one group of Palestinians leaving, but at the same time, there is a resistant movement that is trying to fight back against Israeli forces. Let's start from the Palestinian leadership.
Okay, so I think that we should actually distinguish here between the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian political leadership in 1948 and the Palestinian society, especially when we discuss places like the Katamon neighborhood, where I discuss engage more in what happened to the Palestinian society in these neighborhoods, also in places in Jaffa. And yes, I termed it social collapse. I think it was not an easy motion to do as a historian and as an Israeli historian. And I'm aware of that it's quite controversial, and I'm aware also of the criticism that Palestinian scholars have or might have towards it. However, I still remember also the call by Rashid Khaledi in his seminal article regarding the Palestinians in 1948, study also the internal reasons for the Palestinian debacle in the war. And I think that we as historians, regardless of our national identity, be it Israelis or Palestinians or Americans or any other national community in the world, could not actually avoid this question. Being, of course, aware to our political and ethnic identities. And yes, I think that what happened since beginning in late 1947 and the first month of 1948 in both Palestinian Arab neighborhoods in southwest Jerusalem, such as Katamon, Baqa, Talbiyah, and also in Jaffa, also in areas that I studied less, such as Haifa, mainly in the larger cities. I think that, yes, those areas experienced a social collapse of the Palestinian civilian population, which of course was under military pressure exerted by the Jewish side at the time. Yet, as historians who read Palestinian history, Palestinian documents, Palestinian memoirs, which are especially important, diaries, which are especially important in the case of Katamon, we cannot ignore, actually, the social impacts of what happened in Katamon. Of course, it is obvious that the Palestinian society would not have collapsed without the military pressure of the Jews that became soon later the Israelis. But all in all, Palestinian internal characteristics such as estrangement between middle-class members, especially in New Jerusalem, in the newer quarter of Jerusalem, and also in many quarters of Jaffa, actually facilitated the way towards the Palestinian defeat and the Jewish victory in 1948. We tend to view the Jewish Israelis as superior military and political power in the Middle East compared to the Palestinians, and even compared to other Arab states in the area. But the process that has led to this military and political superiority was not a definite and deterministic process. And this superiority in terms of military power and even political power did not come to exist up until the later phases of the 1948 war, actually started to materialize in the months April, May 1948. So I think that in this regard, the study of the internal structure and the internal events within the Palestinian society in places such as Katamon has a great relevance to us as historians, perhaps even not only to study about or to understand what happened to the Palestinians in 1948 in the Nakba, which is, of course, crucial, but also to understand better the life of the Palestinians as a whole under the mandate, and even before.
I believe that you made a very controversial point indeed about the question of a collapse of a Palestinian political leadership. But it's also true, as you mentioned, Rashid Khalidi some time ago invited scholars, and we've seen a number of scholars coming out and investigating this matter. And more it's becoming clear that there's a dichotomy where obviously you had individuals where just wanted to resist, but you also had other individuals that just folded and were not able to, I would say, develop, I would say, like roll out their political power and to come together, but instead they just made personal choices. And again, you're right. I mean, obviously there is a military pressure, and probably also the idea that the war was going to be short and there would be some sort of a resolution at the end, which obviously didn't happen. So you have two different results here. One on the Zionist side, which was more to conquer in a sense, and the other one probably more about, finding a solution to the conflict and move forward out of that. But again, it's hard to say because eventually events unfolded in one direction and not others. But I'm interested about the question of resistance because, again, Jerusalem was at the very center of the conflict and it didn't fall quite quickly, but we saw different parties fighting, and eventually we'd say the most historical part of the city remained with the Palestinians. And Jerusalem, many would maybe not know much about the events of the war, but certainly they would remember that between 1948 and 67, the city was divided, and the iconic image of the Mandelbaum Gate with the fences and so forth. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the resistance of Jerusalem.
Yes, this is indeed a highly interesting question, because the common historical narrative, not talking now about popular or political narrative, the common historical narrative was that the Palestinians have shown little resistance in 1948, and then Jordanians were superior military power to the Palestinians, better organized, better equipped, trained by the British, even led by British officers, came into Jerusalem, and this is why the fate of East Jerusalem was different than the fate of the western neighborhoods of Jerusalem and the fate of other Palestinian cities that were totally conquered and subjugated and became Israeli cities such as Jaffa and Haifa. If we look more closer about the events in Jerusalem, we see that indeed there was a strong Palestinian resistance in Jerusalem in the last month of 1948, and that Palestinians in Jerusalem, aided by volunteers from the ALA, the Arab Liberation Army, mainly Iraqis and also Syrians and Lebanese, were able to hold their ground, especially in the old city of Jerusalem, even for several days after the British withdrawal from Jerusalem in May 14, 1948. So they were able to hold their ground up until May 19, 1948, and even accomplish military achievements in the internal front within the old city of Jerusalem vis-à-vis the Jewish quarter, the same historical quarter that I mentioned within the old city of Jerusalem. So I think that their resistance, which is especially described perhaps in the best way in the memoirs of Bahjat Abu Rabieh, who was known until recent years, he was still living in Jordan, and he was known as Sheikh al-Munadelin, the elder, not elder statesman, but actually elder fighter, or the eldest fighter, the eldest freedom fighter among the Palestinians. So these combined Palestinian and inter-Arab volunteer resistance have actually paved the way for what became later East Jerusalem under Jordanian rule, state to remain an Palestinian Arab city, of course, between 1948 and 1967, and to a great extent, even to this day, as opposed to the fate of Palestinian Jaffa or Palestinian Haifa. Now, I think that the holiness of Jerusalem, the fact that Jerusalem was a sacred city, also to Christianity, but mainly to Islam, was a main factor in the resistance, in the endurance that Palestinians and also other Arab volunteers were able to show in Jerusalem, that actually paved the way and helped them to maintain the city that at the time was under attack by the Jewish Haganah, the pre-state militia from West Jerusalem, and they were able to hold their position up until of course, the reinforcement of the Arab Legion of Transjordan, that of course was also crucial in the persistence of East Jerusalem as a Palestinian Arab city to this day. Speaking in terms of society, it is also very interesting to mention. Of course, you might say that the neighborhoods in West Jerusalem were geographically surrounded or more closer to the main Jewish neighborhoods of West Jerusalem. But perhaps it is not a coincidence that it was mainly the neighborhoods of the upper middle class of Jerusalem, that collapsed earlier both socially and militarily, while the neighborhoods of more conservative Jerusalem, especially the old city, were able to resist the attack to a larger period of time until, indeed, the Jordanian Legion was able to come and, you might say, I wouldn't say exactly save the day because I just claimed the contrary, but of course it had a very important role in preserving the Arabness of Jerusalem.
Now, the war ended, obviously, and Jerusalem was divided, and that's another story. I want to ask you something about the other side of your work, which is Jaffa. I never really talked about Jaffa in the podcast, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about the city, particularly again the period of the war. How did Jaffa experience the war?
Jaffa actually started the war when it was defined by the UN Partition Resolution, unlike Jerusalem, as a part of the Arab state that should have been formed alongside the Jewish state. I mean, the Arab state of Palestine that did not materialize to this day. But Jaffa should have been an enclave. It was an enclave detached of any territorial contiguity. It was actually surrounded by Jewish Tel Aviv and other towns such as Bat Yam and Holon. And it also had Palestinian Arab hinterland, a village periphery, which was perhaps, but it was a little detached of the city. So you had to go through a kind of a belt of Jewish settlements and neighborhoods to get to the agricultural periphery of Jaffa, of Palestinian Arab Jaffa. Now, at the time that we are talking, Palestinian Arab Jaffa was officially contained a large Jewish population. There was, according to the official numbers, 70,000 Arabs and 30,000 Jews. But the Jews were living in neighborhoods which are now considered to be a part of Tel Aviv, even as a part of the unity between Jaffa and Tel Aviv Jaffa, which have today, since 1949, actually the same municipality, but those areas are considered to be a part of Tel Aviv. And actually, even in the late 1940s, these neighborhoods received most of the municipal services already from the Tel Aviv municipality, and they became quite excluded from the sphere of influence of the Jaffa municipality. So at the time, actually, Jaffa became, for the first time in modern history, actually, an exclusively Palestinian Arab town, with smaller populations of Greeks and Armenians than in Jerusalem, for example. And it was probably the largest Palestinian Arab town at the time, with a population slightly larger than this of Jerusalem, and even probably a little slightly larger than the population of the Palestinian population of Haifa. And it was a cultural hub for the Palestinians. Most of the Palestinian newspapers appeared in Jaffa. Most of the cultural life, cinemas, clubs, even the beginning of theater. It was the hub, the cultural hub of Palestine. It was known as Arus el-Bahr, Bride of the Sea, but also Arus Palestine, the Bride of Palestine. Economically, it had known actually shortages and periods of crisis since 1936, since the Palestinian Arab Revolt, because Jaffa was dependent on the import of orange and citrus projects through the Jaffa harbor. And this was really decimated during the revolt that started with a 6-month strike that included the Jaffa port, unlike the Haifa port, for example, that continued to work during the strike. And later on, it also suffered from difficulties not only during the revolt up until 1939, but in 1939, when the revolt entered, shortly afterwards started the Second World War, where there were another problems of import. And indeed, in 1946, 1947, Jaffa was in the process of cooperation from this prolonged economical debacle. Now, we have also to bear in mind that as a result of this citrus industry, and also Jaffa being the major commercial center of Arab Palestine, there were in Jaffa, we might say, islands of richness and of capital, compared to also vast poverty neighborhoods of Jaffa. So the city, the town, like other cities in the developing world to this day, was characterized by major gaps between different segments of the population. And it was also a hub of internal migration from the village areas of Palestine, and even from some peripheral areas in Syria, to a certain extent also Lebanon, Jordan, and even Egypt, of migrants from other parts of the Arab world. And Jaffa was known, thanks to this cultural diversity and cultural hybridity, Jaffa was known also as El Gharib, the mother of the stranger. Strangers, of course, were mostly Arabs, and most of them were Palestinians, but also from other parts of the near Middle East and even farther. So Jaffa was very, very diverse, might say also culturally hybrid between East and West, like I mentioned before, in West Arab Jerusalem, for example. And I think that it was more fragile due to this both economic hardship and also this great diversity, these huge gaps between new internal migrants from villages, even internal migrants from the Quran area in southwest Syria, and the established local population that was established in Jaffa, some since the early 19th century, some even earlier. There were major gaps. The diversity also meant that in times of crisis, Jaffa was more vulnerable. And its geopolitical position as a neighbor to Tel Aviv, very center of the Jewish Zionist Yishuv or settlement in Palestine, made it specifically vulnerable. And to this we may also lead the political factor that while Jerusalem was politically the hub of those Palestinians who were loyal to the Husseini family or clan that actually led the Palestinian Arab national movement during the Mandate period, Jaffa was mainly led by members of the opposition to the Husseini faction or Husseini political party. So this estrangement, not only on social terms between one hand, the political leadership of the Husseinis were notables vis-a-vis the newer echelons of middle class, but in Jaffa also the political estrangement between the Husseinis and the opposition to the Husseinis also added to the vulnerability of Jaffa. And we see indeed that as soon as hostilities began in December 1947, following the partition resolution, and then in January 1948, Jaffa was indeed in a very fragile situation. And if I talked before about collapse, I think that Jaffa was close to collapse already in January 1948. And then, for a short while, due to the tremendous efforts of local leaders it was able to hold out for a while, and it received help from outside, from the Arab Liberation Army. But finally, when the Irgun, the Jewish opposition, started its attack on Jaffa in late April 1948, then it actually collapsed very quickly. Here also, at first, the Japhite society collapsed at first, in the lack of national or countrywide leadership that it would have been able to identify with. And then shortly afterwards, also the military Arab forces in Jaffa also collapsed. This was augmented also by the attack of the Haganah on the village periphery of Jaffa, even on the outskirts of Jaffa itself. And as a result, Jaffa actually remained empty of most of its inhabitants and of most of its military forces, fighters, and it just surrendered to the Jewish Haganah, the main pre-state militia, even a day before the British final withdrawal from Palestine on May 13, 1948. At the time, only 3,000 Palestinian Arabs had stayed in Jaffa. And as Salim Tamari defined it, what happened was that Jaffa was degraded from the Bride of Palestine to be the Hashish Den of Israel.
I wanted to ask you something in relation to, let's say, approach to understanding Jaffa in Jerusalem. Now, in your book, but also in your writings and other outlets, you often say, you talk about this division, like Jerusalem is a city in the hills, which is sort of distant from the other centers of power, whereas Jaffa as a coastal city was much more connected to other centers. And I was wondering if this sort of different geographical location also played a role in the war itself and in the future of the cities, one essentially divided and one that became part of the newly created state of Israel.
So I actually borrowed these terms, mountain city versus coastal city, from luminaries beginning in the Mediterranean term, luminaries such as Fernand Braudel, and in Middle Eastern history, Albert Hourani. I think that originally it was applied more to the difference between cities such as Beirut and Damascus. Beirut, the more cosmopolitan, Damascus, the more, we'd say, traditional, cohesive, national Arab city. And I think that it was to a large extent also the same between Jaffa and Jerusalem, with, of course, the extent of what happened in neighborhoods in West Jerusalem, which were also cosmopolitan, such as Katamon. All in all, we see that, of course, you might say that it was all geopolitical factors. Jaffa being surrounded by Tel Aviv and other Jewish cities and towns, while Jerusalem had been surrounded by a Palestinian Arab periphery, and the Jews were actually an enclave in Jerusalem. However, if we tend to look more closer, we see that Jews also were a demographical majority within Jerusalem itself in 1948, and still they were not able to translate the demographical majority into an overwhelming military victory, such as in Jaffa. And I think that if we look upon the different behavior of two cities, we see that Jerusalem, especially old Jerusalem, or its eastern parts, more traditional parts, also reinforced, especially during the Mandate, but even in late Ottoman times, by internal migration from Hebron. Today, most Palestinian Jerusalemites are consisting of the descendants of internal migrants from Hebron. And the Hebronites were actually a more cohesive element in the history of Palestinian Jerusalem. As opposed to Palestinian original Jerusalemites, which were tend to be more, we might say, I wouldn't use the word cosmopolitan, of course. It has a very negative historical implications. Remember that the Jews were nicknamed cosmopolitan. But perhaps we might say culturally more open to hybrid culture. A hybrid, cultural hybridity between East and West made people actually, ironically, be more civil. The creation of a civil society that is less nationalistic and more prone to good life, to peaceful existence, and less in favor of military confrontation or military resistance even. So I think that those differences between Jaffa, city with more developed cultural life, or the center of cinema houses in Arab Palestine before 1948, the center of culture, the site of such cultural and social modernity that in a way has not even demonstrated even today in the entire of Arab Palestine. I think that yes, it made perhaps Jaffa and Japhite, and I think that it's very human and very natural phenomenon that people would actually prefer more peaceful life rather than military resistance, the military confrontation. And the more people become more interested in cultural activities, in hybridity, in diverse values, they would become perhaps less cohesive and less. So of course, we have to take also in mind the religious difference. In Jaffa, of course, there are mosques and churches, but Jaffa is not a sacred city. It has no ancient sacred sites, perhaps with the exception of some Christian sites, but of course it doesn't have the crucial importance of Jerusalem as a religious center, which would actually encourage people to sacrifice their lives in order to preserve and keep the religious places, as such as is happening to this day, actually, when Jerusalem is still the core of the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis this day, and not only in national or nationalistic terms, but also in religious terms.
Well, indeed, today, if we look at the question of the sort of Temple Mount of the Haram al-Sharif, and so we can see how just that small area is highly contested and certainly the very heart of a conflict. Now, I have a couple of questions left, very much about your current and future projects. So I was wondering if you can tell us what you've been working on right now, and perhaps if you can give us a hint of your coming and future works.
Well, I'm in the finalizing stages of research on the planning. It began actually as a project of, on the planning of the Zionist leadership towards the future of the Palestinian Arab citizens who were supposed to be living in the Jewish state according to the partition resolution in 1947. And it emerged into a kind of a project regarding also some of the views of this leadership towards the future possible existence of Palestinian Arabs in the future Jewish state or political entity, even in earlier stages. And unlike my previous research, it is a research concentrated mostly, almost exclusively on the Jewish political side. And it is a study of political and cultural or political intellectual history, very quite unlike some of the studies that I conducted in the past. Perhaps it is a little bit reminiscent of some of the studies that I conducted on the Katamon neighborhood, especially on the Sakakini household and Khalil Sakakini as an embodiment of the emerging Palestinian Arab middle class under the mandate. And this brings me to the next project that I'm planning or starting to plan on these days, which I think would center around Sakakini and his diaries. I think that Sakakini was indeed an extraordinary person, extraordinary writer. I think that his diaries, which were published in full in Arabic only in the 21st century, are unique. They are a unique source of Palestinian cultural history, social history, to a certain extent, sometimes even political history. And they were not yet delved in fully. Indeed, in recent years, there was published only in Hebrew so far an educational biography of Sakakini by Kamal Moed, who is a Palestinian Arab citizen of Israel. Hence, it was published in Hebrew. And Kamal is a scholar of education. And I had the honor to be a scientific historical editor of this publication, and I hold Kamal's work in the highest esteem. Yet I think that Sakakini should also be studied on a broader term than his educational creed, which is fascinating. I think that Sakakini should be studied as a kind of an embodiment, perhaps, not only of the Palestinian Arab middle class, but perhaps even of the Palestinian Arab generation of the mandate period. I think that this would be my next project, because I've been actually dreaming of conducting a research in this field for several years now, and I hope that upon finalizing the current project, I will be able to move smoothly into this next project about Sakakini and his generation.
This was Itamar Radai, Senior Lecturer in Israel Studies at the Open University of Israel and author of Palestinians in Jerusalem and Jaffa, 1948, A Tale of Two Cities, published by Routledge in 2016. Itamar, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Roberto. It has been my pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.